Before we pick up where we left off with the in-depth timeline of the Halo series, I feel like some ground rules are in order. This video will be covering from the end of the Forerunner Flood War, with the Forerunners exiling themselves, leaving the mantle behind for humanity, all the way into the prelude into the Great War, or the Human Covenant conflict era, which we will be delving into with the next timeline video. And the overall is, the Halo TV series will not be included in this video due to the fact that it is a different universe entirely compared to the canon entry, which is what I mainly focus on when constructing these timelines, what is canon versus what isn't. So with the community already disclosing the Silver Timeline or TV show as a separate entity to the overarching lore of the canonized series, let's get into the timeline of the restoration period of the universe. From where we last left the Halo universe, we saw that the Forerunners were placed into a difficult position with thousands of plans put into action against the Flood, only for them to fail. However, there was to be one that would prove to be successful in saving all life from the endless torment of the parasite, the Halo Array. The Forerunners had originally built these for defense, however now they would be used to end all life in the galaxy, ironically to preserve life in the end of days. Some would question this last attempt to defeat the Flood, while others claimed that there was no other choice, they must activate the rings, and so they did. With the galaxy being bathed in the energy streams, all life in the galaxy would cease. However, the Flood would still persist, but with no life to assimilate, the Sentinel forces would sweep through the worlds, burning all of the immobilized forms away. However, this is not where the Flood would end. As per the Forerunners' instructions, several infection forms and spores were to be captured and withheld within the several installations to be further analyzed and studied by the monitors in an effort to find new ways of combating them, and perhaps even creating a cure in case the parasite had reached worlds outside of their reach in other galaxies. And should they return, the new worlds would have no defense, so this plan was put into execution to be placed under maximum restriction as to not untie the knot they had tied so tightly round. The next part of the plan was to seed life back into the universe, restoring the galaxy to its form, with the worlds prospering once again, with the life workers transporting the monitors to their assigned installations, imprisoning the Endless away so that the threat they posed to the reforming species could be eliminated, with offensive bias being charged as their warden. And so the story of the Forerunners was at an end, leaving all that they had once built behind. However, the story for the galaxy was just beginning. Welcome to the complete history of the restoration of the Halo universe. During these isolating and lonesome times in the space between worlds, the monitors of the installation would organize several meetings as to keep updating each other. Most notable of these would be the conversation between 343 Guilty Spark of Installation 04 and 03049 Abject Testament of Installation 03.
In accordance with the final dictum of the Ecumene Council, I have released myself of all remaining connections to my former station. This was not difficult. What was could never be again. We had seen to that quite thoroughly. Prior to my final journey through the Great Portal, a gathering of my fellow monitors was convened upon the Lightworkers' Crash to distribute the final index collection. It was most unusual to have this vessel of rebirth play host to such an event. Even though Lightworker ships were the only ones still allowed slip-space permissions. Lightworkers were responsible for getting us to our places on the active facilities of the array. While all of this was in accordance with the plan, one entirely unsatisfactory breakdown remained. We had no contact with the domain. The history of all forerunners was now lost to us. We relied upon the permanence of the domain to preserve our record of the events that led to this point. But without that record, would future civilizations know anything about us? Or only of our weapons? My fellow monitor, 049 Abject Testament, had only one comment on this before we went our separate ways.
We deserve to be forgotten.
Perhaps. Perhaps. But now, the portal opens, and through it, the familiar shape awaits. Halo. Home.
These meetings, however, would cease in 94,368 BCE, with 343 Guilty Spark updating the logs of Installation 04, in which he would continue to do so to maintain a history of the current events in the event of discovery. The species would be able to see a complete history of the installation since the firing of the array, and learn from it the shocking history it holds. This is where 343 Guilty Spark would finish his assigned researching duties, assigned to him by the Forerunner Council, and places himself into a state of hibernation for at least 150 years.
Entropy. It has now been 3,000 years since my last contact with any of the other caretakers of the Halo array. Despite clear communications protocol, my fellow monitors have either chosen to ignore, or, more likely, have lost the ability to engage in our scheduled updates. The continued lapse of the domain means that we are stuck with achingly slow wormhole superluminal communications. Prior to this total communication shutdown, the only messages I received in the preceding 4,573 years were incomplete and quite perplexing transmissions from Installation 05. I suspected that Monitor 2401 Penitent Tangent was not functioning correctly for some time before his messages ceased. I have logged my concerns about his ability to perform his duties. At this point, however, I'm not sure who I file logs for. 2401 may be destined for madness. There are fail-safes for this, I know. I hope they work. I will continue to visit the projection systems at the assigned dates. Perhaps the other monitors are dealing with interfering galactic phenomena, or unexpected system failures. 3,000 years of system failures. Indeed. In the meantime, I have exhausted all scheduled research activities assigned by the Council. Once those experiments were complete, I shut down all Sentinel function and put myself into a state of significant hibernation to measure performance of the installation with negligible upkeep.
$39,920 years later, in 57,448 BCE, the reseeding of life had been completed, with the worlds prospering and beginning their journey to restoring their lost empires. Whether they would rebuild them to a T or build something entirely new was to be in the hands of fate now. Some of the species would work together, creating a better future for all. However, in other worlds, the species would fight amongst each other, creating conflicts that lead into wars breaking out, delaying their journey. However, perhaps these conflicts would give the respected species their own set of lessons to abide by, to learn from, allowing for alliances to bridge the gap and unity to build the path to becoming a stronger faction and society within the galaxy. However, something would eventually happen within space, with a meteor soaring on through that was approaching a planet that looked similar to Earth. It would be later known by humanity as Sigma Octonus 4. The meteor would eventually impact the atmosphere, burning up and impacting the surface of this world, which held an artifact of Forerunner design. The artifact was said to be a crystalline object that contained star charts within the structure, with coordinates leading to the Sol system, where Installation 04 would be located. 23,080 years later, the year of record would be 34,368 BCE, and the galaxy had been continuing its restoration process, as yes, the species had been restored successfully all those years ago, but they still had a long way to go before returning to their former glory. However, over the years, the Monitor 343 Guilty Spark would reactivate from another hibernation period and begin his duties once again to safeguard the ring and the terrible cargo it holds when an unidentified ship would crash in Sector 1215 of Installation 04, prompting 343 Guilty Spark to investigate.
After 150 years with no noticeable impact upon installation systems or integrity, even in hibernation I became bored. This was quite troubling, as I was led to believe I was not capable of such a state. This was one of the gifts I was promised, an end to strife. I am aware of the dangers of a system such as myself losing operational focus. Quite troubling. I wonder if my fellow monitors are experiencing similar states, or if this is because of my particular path to this installation. For amusement, I have begun a series of experiments involving the evacuation of all matter from contained sections of my installation. By measuring the geologic effects of exposure to the vacuum of space and the eventual biological recovery of these sections, I anticipate getting valuable insight into emergency response scenarios in case of sentient proximity warning. They have not attempted to exit the remains of their vessel. I say remains because their landing was either not executed adequately, or this vessel lacked significant maneuvering capability. The visible portions of the vessel have suffered catastrophic structural damage during the violent landing experience. I have detected atmospheric leaks in 17 distinct locations along the hull. My analysis shows that the mixture of gases coming from the ship matches the natural atmosphere on my installation almost exactly. Perhaps the occupants, if they still live, were originally cataloged here. Perhaps these beings will confirm that the plan was successful, and that the galaxy has returned to its proper cadence. I am beyond optimistic. But I do not understand why these sentients have not attempted to exit their vessel. Other than the leaking atmosphere, the only thing emanating from this wreckage is an automated distress call. I am currently translating this automated broadcast, but with such a limited dataset and no direct communication, I do not anticipate full comprehension. Given the short-range nature of this craft, it is likely that other vessels are nearby. But, in accordance with procedure, I am blocking the distress call. No communication of the location of any installation is permissible. I admit great curiosity about these visitors. While the plan is quite clear about procedure for this situation, I have my doubts. How many failure points can the plan sustain before blind adherence becomes counterproductive? Surely, in light of all that has changed, I should be able to modify my responses to adapt to it. No, I have duties. And I have a terrible cargo here. I must be sure. I shall obey and content myself to monitor. I hope they go out soon, though. So many questions to ask. So many questions.
After 4,545 years of their guardianship of the installation, some of the monitors begin to lose their focus, with boredom clouding their judgment and dulling their senses.
Construction of a sarcophagus around the unexplained vessel was completed today. No occupants ever exited. No attempts to communicate were made, other than the automated broadcast that repeated every 72.83 seconds until the signal terminated 1 week ago. In accordance with procedure, no attempts at physical or remote contact were made with any survivors of this vessel's inelegant landing. Atmosphere from inside the craft stopped venting 2 weeks before the signal ceased. No relationship between these two events can be established with certainty. Gases that did escape were sterilized. No further sign of alien visitors or rescuers has been identified on any sensor systems. I have now endured 60,000 years without word from outside the array. I have no way to know whether we actually saved the galaxy we destroyed. And because of protocol, I sat silently while my first chance to be judged for those acts died. To say that I regret being forced to this outcome is a tremendous understatement. But as I perform my inspection of the quarantine labs today, I am reminded of the gravity of my responsibilities. Just one of these spores, if released from this facility, would render the ultimate judgment against our self-appointed role as protectors of this galaxy. When the plan to maintain the Halo array was created, it was a point of some contention whether we should preserve any remnant of the flood infection. Many thought this unwise, as there was a notable chance that one day one of our containment facilities might be breached. Those who held this belief were almost successful at convincing the Ecumen Council to destroy the last flood samples. But oddly enough, it was the librarian who decided otherwise. And I believe she was correct. I know in a way I cannot logically explain that there exists a way to actually defeat the flood. To immunize, to cure. I still struggle with multiple layers of memory of fighting the flood. But I know this cure is possible, even though the full genius of the Forerunners was unable to achieve it. The Forerunners' ancient enemy held and used that knowledge once, but it was denied to us. And without samples for further study, that cure will never again be found. Of course, I have no reason to believe that here lies the entirety of the parasite. It may be waiting in the frozen void beyond this galaxy, or worse, inexorably drifting toward us. I don't know what survives out beyond my installation, but I know that in order for anything to survive, I have to protect this installation and its quarantine very carefully. Yes, the librarian was right to store it, examine it, continue to seek a cure. Still, next visitor, things will be different.
In 29,823 BCE, 000 Tragic Solitude of Installation 00 would dismantle a Despair-class fighter that had once belonged to the Librarian, where the Monitor would put the fighter back into its original design seed. 2401 Penitent Tangent would also lose its focus in its duties as well, which would soon lead into a containment breach. that would birth a new Gravemind. However, 343 Guilty Spark at this time would be complaining about the Forerunner's choices in placing the monitors, along with his own loneliness, beginning a state of rampancy or insanity.
Alone. Alone, 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 alone. Am I the only intelligence left? Waiting here on this ring for a rebirth never truly conceived. Guarding a weapon with no targets. A weapon I could tune to any target. This is not what I had in mind when I volunteered. Not what I had in mind at all. I was naive to think I understood what this installation meant. We were all so naive. Looking back, we should have done a few things differently. For one thing, we should have installed 2 caretakers per installation. Because I am alone, I'm losing focus. And that is very, very dangerous for a system such as myself. Perhaps a visit to the nearby gas giant is in order. My impulse drives could certainly make the journey. A few hundred years of travel might do me some good. There it was again. How very unproductive of me. It seems strange that the librarian did not account for this. Her strength was always in planning and positioning the pieces and then being bold enough to let it happen. To let her plans come true. I was a part of many of those plans long before I knew for certain that she was real. Before any of us were. But at the end, we had only a fragment of her brilliance left to us, and I fear that she did not fully appreciate the nature of my situation here, the problems in my post, but even a fragment of... Fragment, yes! Oh dear, here it comes again.
In 2200 BCE, 27,623 years later, the shyuums, who had managed to recover from the annihilation of the galaxy faster than any other species, had been in perfect harmony for centuries, never to turn against one another, seeing no point in fighting. That was until they discovered the forerunner technology present on their home world, of whom they had no memory of, and of the Forerunner's actions against their ancestors. The society of the shyuum would come under a great divide during these times, with one side being known as the Stoics, who believed that the Forerunner relics were sacred and not to be altered or otherwise tampered with, and the other side would be known as the Reformists, who wished to closely examine the artifacts and use them for their species' advances in their society, reverse engineering them to serve their needs. Over the years, the two sides would not be able to find common ground in the debates, which would begin to spark the War of Wills. The war would last for 100 years, where the Reformists would possess a great advantage against the Stoics, as they would use Forerunner technology to aid them in the battlefields, whereas the other side would use only their native arsenal. However, the advantage worked in more ways than just one, with the Forerunner technology being used, was to shield the Reformists in a way, as the Stoics could not bear to destroy the Forerunner arsenal, even though they were truly enraged. Due to their beliefs, they simply could not win. 40 days into the war, however, the Reformists would commandeer a Forerunner dreadnought, taking flight, but in doing so had broken off a colossal chunk of rock that would eventually become the foundation for High Charity in the years to come. Nearing the end to the bloodshed, the Stoics would tell the Reformists that they would be damned for their impotence towards the gods in a series of messages. But by 2100 BCE, the war was fought and won by the Reformists, showing their dominance over the opposing forces, which is one way to win an argument, I suppose. The Reformists would then take their forces aboard the Forerunner dreadnought and take it to the vast beyond, leaving the Stoics behind in their ruins. However, they would come to know that they were in fact doomed due to their rather small numbers aboard the dreadnought. With their gene pool being very small, they would enact strict controls on the topic of mating in order to prevent disastrous inbreeding. The Stoics, on the other hand, continued to take the harsh path towards their advancements, and over the many generations that followed, they would soon reach the 5th level of technological height, refusing to use Forerunner technologies to aid them, with them carving their own path with their own technology. In 1041 BCE, 1059 years after the War of Wills, Pervading Stone would be born on the Forerunner dreadnought, who would go on to lead the Keepers of the Dawn in his later years, which was to be a sub-faction or group of the Reformists. 23 years later, in 1018 BCE, Breaking Shadow would be born as well aboard the dreadnought, who would go on to become one of the Reformist leaders in the years to come. 61 years after this event, the Prophet of Inner Conviction would also be born in 957 BCE. 19 years down the line, in 938 BCE, the Reformist Shyuums would discover the world of Ulgethon, where they would meet the Sangheili species for the first time, and would send in a party to explain that they too worship the Forerunners as gods, telling them that the technology was left behind to them to be used by them as gifts from their gods. However, the Sangheili's beliefs shifted more towards the Stoics' belief that the artifacts were sacred and not to be tampered with under any circumstances, on which the Arbiter from this time would behead the Shyuums group, sending their remains back to the dreadnought, which would shock the Reformists, who had gone to them of peaceful intent, only to be cut down. This instance was what had led into the year-long conflict known as the Desecration of Ulgethon, where the two sides were engaged in a long and bloody conflict, which would eventually lead into the War of Beginnings. 16 years into the war, a Sangheili known as Pelisar Olam was born, who would earn the title of Pelisar the Strident, in which he would become one of the leaders for the Sangheili forces in the war effort. Pushing 3 years deeper into the war, another notable Sangheili would be born, known as Usur Zealous, who would climb through the ranks and become known as the commander of their forces. However, over the years, the Sangheilis would see that even with their great skill, they couldn't possibly hope to win due to being limited to one spacefaring vessel, and the Shyuums had a great technological advantage against them. And so history was to repeat itself, with the Reformists pushing the Sangheilis back to their home world of Sanghelios, where the conflict would devastate both the moons and the planet itself. All the while the two sides fought for the Forerunner artifacts, bathing in each other's blood. However, when some of the Reformists had felt like they had proven their superiority over the Sangheili faction, and talks for peace were in order for the two sides to come together, Pervading Stone disagreed and vowed to end the Sangheili society by killing every last one of them, a goal that was motivated by the loss of his father in the siege of Old Gefon. Breaking Shadow would then lead a task force into stopping the mad Shyuum, ensuing a battle within their own faction, a battle that would eventually end with Pervading Stone's death. After the conflict had ended, the Sangheilis would lay down their weapons and begin negotiations with the Shyuum for a way out of the war. With the two sides having their own issues plaguing them, they would come together. With the Shyuum, they did not possess the numbers to construct an army of warriors to the extent that the Sangheilis had achieved. However, they did not possess the technological advantage, so they would talk on how to eliminate these issues to build a strong foundation for a covenant, which would lead into the signing of the Writ of Union between the two species. Pelisar the Strident, who represented the Sangheili, signing the treaty, and Breaking Shadow, representing the Shyuum reformists, signing as well. This was to be the moment where the two sides would join as one, creating the Covenant and marking the beginning of the great journey. The Shyuum, however, would never forget the mantle of the Arbiter and would hail the title with great respect with their new union, or covenant. The rest of the Sangheili society would eventually come around, reluctantly betraying their beliefs in favor of survival, and in becoming a stronger faction overall, marking the end of the war in 852 BCE, where the prophets commissioned the construction of a mobile home world that would be shared by the Covenant, to be known in the years as High Charity. This would begin the Age of Reconciliation within the Great Journey. However, only 1 year into the New Order, heresy would break out within the ranks of the Sangheili, with Usa Celis becoming the one to lead the group of 400 elites away from their home world and to Shield World 0673. In which they would begin to colonize the world in hopes to shelter themselves from the new covenant hailing from above, with their newly founded faction being known as the Usans. Another year later, in 850 BCE, the Prophet of Inner Conviction, the Minister of Relative Reconciliation, and the Sangheili Treaty Commission all come together to talk about the disappearance of Usa Zealous and his followers, in which the Ministry of Anticipatory Security would be established by the High Prophet of Excellent Redolence, and a Shyuum politician known as Renaud Cousteau would be appointed for the role of the Minister of the organization within the Covenant, in which they would task the Prophet of Inner Conviction to venture to Janjur Quam to retrieve a group of stoic females and a forerunner luminary, which was a forerunner construct used to scan for and identify artifacts of forerunner design. The minister would then threaten to place the Prophet of Inner Conviction into a selected group of Shyuums that were denied the ability to breed under the law of the Covenant, known as the Roll of Celibates, should he refuse to go. And so, because of this, he complied with the mission reluctantly. Meanwhile, the Usans continue to develop their colony on the Shield World, naming it the Refuge. 295 Enduring Bias, a monitor of the Shield World, would inform Usa and his mate Solon of a process on the Shield World known as the Dissembler, in which the Shield World would break apart while maintaining certain areas to be habitable. Usa would be intrigued by the news and goes to investigate further, along with any other secrets the world may have in store for him and his new faction. However, over a certain period of time, some of the Sangheilis would become distrustful of Usa and begin to conspire against his leadership within his absence. Soon, the vengeful vitality would arrive at Janjorquam, and a team would be sent down to the surface to complete their objectives. As they arrive at the Grotto of the Great Transition, they would claim the Luminary. However, another twist in these events would occur with the betrayal of the Shyuum Captain Vervin and a Sangheili ranger known as Loquin on the orders of the Minister. But the group would eventually escape, and the betrayers would either be killed or captured by the Stoics. Back on the Shield world, romance is in the air with Tersha falling for Nur-Mul, but as they were walking together through Ursa's garden, they would overhear a plot to seize power within the colony and to overthrow Ursa. And when the two were discovered to be spying on them, they would run away, losing the elites. But before they could say anything to Ursa, he would be told of Tersha and Nur-Mul's betrayal, with the conspiring elites lying to the one they seek to backstab. However, things were going to get worse before they get better. A lot worse. With the Covenant discovering the rebels' location on the distant Shield world. As he gets this news, the former hierarch Qualum would rush to the other hierarchs, interrupting the Prophet of Inner Conviction's trial, since he was unsuccessful in his mission due to the betrayal of the Minister, where they would demote the Minister for his part to play in these events, and send Inner Conviction to the Shield world, where he would lead a fleet to the distant world, in which they would arrive at the refuge, going into battle with the mindset of eliminating this pocket of resistance to their holy order. The Prophet would contact Ursa, asking him to surrender. However, he would refuse the offer, and after a lengthy battle with the Ursan Sangheilis, the Sentinels, and the Covenant, Ursa would then see that he was to be within a losing fight, and his death was to be drawing near. He would re-establish contact with the Prophet, telling him to pull his forces back, or they will perish with his own, and soon he would do just that, with the Shield world breaking apart, killing hundreds of Covenant and Ursan forces, and once it was done, the Prophet wouldn't even bother looking for survivors. Instead, orders to be taken back to High Charity, to be judged for his partial failure. 59 years later, in 791 BCE, the Covenant's capital ship had finished construction, giving them their holy city of refuge and of their central government or hierarchy. This would mark the age of conversion. 2 years after this grand event, Shyuum experiments with the Dreadnought would open up a new path to them, with them discovering a giant gas planet known as T in the Severe System. After 5 years, the Covenant would then investigate the surrounding moons of the gas giant, most notable being Rentus, with the Lekgolo colonies devouring the artificial rings of T built by the Forerunners, which would spark another war with the Covenant, attacking the Lekgolo, who would combine together, creating a larger threat overall. Another twist in the war would come when the Covenant would discover that there were 2 colonies of Lekgolo, one that ate anything and everything they would come across, destroying artifacts of Forerunner design in the process, and others that would eat everything except for the artifacts, in which the prophets would send in the current Arbiter of this era, who would find the good and useful colonies to learn more about their capabilities in helping to defeat the bad ones. However, they could never have expected that he would return with a proposal, in which he tells them that the Lekgolos could aid them greatly in the future, and should be a part of their covenant. And more surprising, they would actually agree with the Arbiter, So that is what they do, bringing in the compliant Legolo species into the fold, allowing them to be a part of the rite of union alongside the Sangheilis. All the while, the rest of the Covenant focused on eradicating the rest of the species, burning them away from the Forerunner artifacts. This would later be logged in the history of the Covenant as the taming of the Hunters. 136 years later, in 648 BCE, the Shyuums would announce to the rest of the Covenant of the loss of their home world, Janjurquam, due to a natural stellar collapse. In these trying times, the Covenant capital would then become the Shyuums' surrogate home world, which would now be formally released after 2 centuries of construction of the space station. In 480 BCE, 160 years later, on a planet we are intimately familiar with, being known as Earth, the Battle of Thermopylae would take place, where the defense of Greece would initiate with 300 Spartans fighting off the Persian army with swords, shields, and spears within the mountain pass, in which they would be successful in repelling the attack. 550 years later, in the first human century, in the year of 79, Mount Vesuvius would erupt for the first time in human history, which leads to the total destruction and annihilation of Pompeii. In 1066, the Battle of Hastings would soon occur, which the strategy they would use would be instrumental later in the timeline within the Spartan II program. In 1112, the Covenant would find Palamok in the Naprit system. However, when they would arrive on the planet, they would find a species called the Yanmis, who were enraged at them for digging up the terrain in their pursuit of Forerunner artifacts that they had believed were hidden below the surface, which then sparked a conflict. The Yanmi would shortly be defeated by the Covenant forces and would be forced into their ranks as Covenant workers. 230 years after that, in 1342, the Covenant would discover the Kig-Ya, who attempted to resist against their assimilation into the Alliance. However, they would soon recognize that the Covenant were a superior force to their own and would submit to their overwhelming dominance. The Kig-Ya would then take on the role of scouts, explorers, and traders within the Covenant's ranks. However, they were also motivated by the wealth and power of the Covenant. Back on Earth, the printing of the Bible would be completed 114 years later in 1456, and in late 1552 the Shyuum began to develop ways into expanding their lifespans to an even greater length, so that they could closer resemble that of their Forerunner gods, who could live on for centuries. In 1775, the Marine Corps of the United States would be created, and within the period of World War II, the invention of nuclear weaponry would be put to use against the Japanese, with the use of the nuclear warheads. And shortly, the war would end, with humanity coming closer together to pursue a better tomorrow, forming the United Nations. However, each country would still maintain their own government, but the nations of planet Earth would be united. In 1982, Dana Aubrey would be born in San Francisco, California. In 1995, Microsoft would introduce the Windows 95 operating system for PC. David George and Aaron Elliott would also found the Society of Ancients, which was an organization that compiles information connecting to the possibility of alien life, with those aliens being called by them as ancients. The organization would look into several unexplained occurrences such as Stonehenge, crop circles, and the Antikythera mechanism. However, many people would still be skeptic of their claims, but an event would soon take place that would leave a lasting impact within the organization and would motivate them to continue investigating further, with that event happening in 1996 as Edgar Dean Mitchell, who was a former Apollo 14 astronaut, has an interview where he would state, "I have been, over the years, very skeptical like many others, but in the last 10 years or so, I've come to realize that the evidence is building up to make this a valid and researchable question." In 1997, Margaret Effendi would begin to keep bees in a beehive as a hobby. 2 years later, she would give a batch of honey to her friends in which they loved it, which would motivate her into buying a second beehive, founding her business as Margaret's House of Bees. 5 years later, in 2004, a temporal rift in space and time would open up, bringing the UNSC's Apocalypso AI Melissa into this point in time. If only that was the extent of the issue. However, a Covenant AI known as the Seeker would pursue her. Unfortunately, Melissa had become fragmented due to an alien artifact splitting her into 3 parts and somehow was transferred into the internet, where a program on the website I Love Bees would attempt to repair the damage that had been done. The program, known as System Peril Distributed Reflex, or SPIDER for short, would recognize the Seeker as a foreign application and attempts to destroy it. The Seeker would recognize that it cannot defeat the Spider, so it convinces Melissa that it was the Spider and asks for her to shut down the old version, in which she complies. The Seeker would then pick up where the Spider left off, repairing Melissa. However, while it does that, it corrupts her goals with its own. However, there was something it did not account for, and that was another version of herself being produced from within herself. Seeming as Melissa had become so fragmented, a buried personality would break off, creating a new entity known only as the Sleeping Princess, who would eventually go on to befriend the Seeker, who asks her for information, but it would receive so much more than that. She would bestow human concepts onto it, such as fear and humor. In return for this, the Seeker would protect her from Melissa, who came to absorb her, burying her in her own code once again. However, Melissa would overcome the Seeker and imprison the princess. The Seeker would then go against its primary function as the Covenant AI to save Melissa by absorbing her without completely destroying her. When the rift in space and time was about to close, however, Melissa would be torn away back to her own time and place. But the Seeker wouldn't be so lucky. Instead, it would be left alone within the program, with the reactivated Spider resulting in the Seeker's destruction. Dr. Jonas Volman, the author of the Castaway Theory, goes missing in 2005. However, he would not leave without first giving Thompson Sanatos a message, stating, "It's time to start asking questions again." In 2021, the International Society of Civil Engineers was established. The organization would stand to advance and promote civil engineering through the generations, in which they would succeed in the years to come. On the other side of the galaxy, however, an advancement would occur within the Covenant in the year of 2070, with the Celia pattern heavy corvette designed by master shipwright Rebore entering service, ready to be added to their fleet. The United Nations at this point in time would now seek to merge the governments of their own nations into one, which would take time for all of the world leaders to agree on. However, in 2075, the unified Earth government would be implemented, which would act as the central civilian government throughout the Earth, stretching outward to a portion of colonies along the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy. The newly built government also encompassed the United Nations from around this time, but would also go on to encompass the United Nations Space Command, or UNSC for short, and the Colonial Administration Authority once they were to be implemented or established within their order. 5 years later, serious efforts were being put into place to colonize Luna, Mars, and other sites throughout the Solar System by the human nations in 2080. 49 years later and into the 22nd century, the year would now be 2129, with the United Nations continuing to colonize several worlds, asteroids, and moons. They would begin the training programs of ODSTs, who would be trained in the arts of dropping behind enemy lines for either recon, sabotage, or assassination missions to be completed. 6 years later, the Covenant would finish constructing a new assault carrier class ship known as the Shadow of Intent, with it entering service a few months later. However, the Covenant would eventually discover a new species in the universe at the beginning of 2142 with the subjugation of the Ungoi homeworld, in which they would surrender almost immediately in the presence of the Sangheilis and are forced into the Covenant. However, from around this time, the Ungoi would be mainly used as cannon fodder or distractions among the battlefield, sent blindly without weapons to their deaths. The incorporation of the species into the Covenant was due to their ability to breed and populate very quickly, which grows the Covenant's population into a more terrifying force. However, an event would soon take place that would bring great shame to the Sangheilis and the rank of the Arbiter. In 2152, the Arbiter known as Fao Chavami began to see the Sangheilis had strayed from their beliefs of honor and only fought for power and supremacy over all other life. With the might of the new order of the Covenant, he would talk to the Shyuum prophets, challenging their beliefs of the religion of the Covenant, the Great Journey. He called them out for using this false belief to achieve and maintain power over his people. One of the hierarchs would plead with him to be reasonable, to accept the Great Journey. However, he would do the complete opposite, telling them that their Great Journey was to be a lie, and they would declare Chavami a heretic. Hacker, who was within Fao's clan at the time, would take complete advantage of these turn of events. He would seek to gain influence from the clan. The hierarchs would support Hacker, who would then send assassins to dispatch Chavami. Once they were able to catch up to him, they would attempt to defeat him. However, after a brief battle, Fao Chavami would kill all of them, sparing none. Hacker would then go for the heart of the matter, forcing Fao's closest friend to kill his wife, so that Fao would be provoked into a duel with Hacker. Taken over by grief for his wife's murder, Fao would track Hacker down, but not before having to destroy a large Covenant formation that had been sent to take him down. The two would fight on top of a forerunner structure. Within the duel, the fallen Arbiter would call upon all of his skill and tricks he had learned along the way to end Hacker's life. However, that would not be enough to save his own, as Hacker had struck a fatal blow to Fao, but Fao had managed to kill Hacker, and the two would bleed out together, fading into myths and legends among the Covenant's society. The The hierarchs would then use these turn of events to put into motion the new plan for the arbiters of the future, with all of the privileges and prestige being stripped of the rank. The title would now be a badge of shame instead of being known to be the pinnacle of the Sangheili culture, and those who were to become arbiters would be sent on suicide missions, with the promise that if they should perish on the battlefield wearing the armor, they will die with honor. However, the humans would have their own problems with a violent movement arising from the European city of Catrius. The group also had a fascist ideology known as the Friedens. In 2158, they would target an embassy within the European of Finia, destroying the structure with explosives that are akin to what the military forces use at this point in time. As soon as the United Nations found out about the terror attack, they would label the movement as a terrorist organization. They then would organize UN colonial advisors to IO to help policing operations. In March of 2160, the Jovian Moons campaign had begun with the movement attacking the colonial advisors, leading into a 3-month skirmish campaign on the moon of Io. The conflicts would escalate the tensions throughout the human territories, with secessionist attacks occurring all over, with splinter cells rising up on planets like Earth, leading into future conflicts. The campaign would be the bloodiest set of battles in human history since the Second World War. Fortunately, the conflict on the Jovian Moons would end in June of the same year, with the secessionist attacks falling short, and many would speculate that the worst had passed, with the bloodshed ceasing, at least for now. However, the bloodshed would return, with a war coming from the rainforests of South America in 2162, known to humanity as the Rainforest Wars, with the United Nations, Frieden forces, and the Kozlovic forces all clashing over ideological differences, which would last for 19 months. In the later periods of the wars, a Neo-Frieden faction would appear when the two sides of the Frieden faction had faced off against each other in combat, leading into the Battle of Delambre. The Neo side of the faction would then turn to the United Nations to begin negotiations. Once again, however, the conflict would inspire even more battles to take place, inspiring extremists to attack from within the Mars colony, which would eventually begin the Mars campaign later down the line. The Rainforest Wars had devastated the country, causing a massive famine, bringing in more suffering to the people of Earth. While the war was taking place, the United Nations would create the United Security Acts of 2162 and Homeland Security Act of 2162. As the wars came to a close, the UNSC would be established by the United Nations in 2163, and their military merging with the United Nations Space Command to eliminate the rebel organizations. However, one of the conflicts that had arose from the Rainforest Wars would inspire another set of conflicts with the campaign on the planet Mars, where the previous three factions would clash once again. In the following year, the UNSC successfully deploys Marines on Mars. With recruitment centers and propaganda tactics, the UNSC in this campaign would continue to bolster their forces, pushing the other factions back. The United Nations in the next year would extend out the UN Genetic Rights Act towards the colonies across human space within 2165, and then in 2166, the Mars campaign would officially end. However, only 1 year later, the leader of one of the factions, Vladimir Kozlov, would be killed with his family in a bombing on the lunar colony. Over the following year, in 2170, the two opposing factions' numbers would shrink and diminish, and the Friedens and Kozlovics would eventually surrender, ending the conflicts for good this time. However, there was another threat to humanity, with that being overpopulation throughout the human territories, along with the famine brought about by the war campaigns. These two would threaten to destabilize the economy in the following years for humanity. 8 years later, ONI, or Office of Naval Intelligence, would be created, in which the organization would seek new ways to ensure human survival, researching and developing new ways of solving such issues that plagued the human race. In 2204, the unified Earth government would gain full autonomy in an effort to maintain power and control across the several territories of human space. In April of 2215, Wallace Fujikawa would be born, who would go on to co-creating the slip space drive for all UNSC ships later on in his future career. And 3 years after this, the M808 Scorpion tank would be introduced to the UNSC, and 2 years after this development, Thomas Fleming Shaw would also be born, who would help Wallace in creating the slip space drive. Leading into the 24th century, Thomas and Wallace would lead a team of researchers into secretly creating a slip space drive in 2291, which would allow for more efficient travel through space for both time and resources, covering greater distances. 2 years into the next century, New Mombasa would be chosen to be the first city on Earth to have a space tether built into the heart of the city, which would be later known as the New Mombasa Orbital Elevator. With overpopulation creeping up behind humanity at this time, the unified Earth government would commission the first of many colony ships to be constructed, and in 2310 they would reveal the finished product to the public at this moment in human history. The thought of taking a ride to one of the inner colonies was becoming more and more of an attractive thought to the people of Earth. The Earth government would also plan to send the military to the colonies to further spread out the fleet, which would be the catalyst to humanity's introduction to the Covenant, where only the best and most qualified members of the military would be sent to the closer worlds of Earth, due to the perception of the inner colonies to become the most elite, best and brightest of all of humanity. At least, that's what the government had intended to be had. The Colonial Administration Authority and the Colonial Military Authority would be later established this year to support this expansion. The Committee of Minds for Security would hold a session at this point in time, discussing the likelihood of hostile species or civilizations, where they would begin to create the first contact scenarios and protocols to deal with such a threat. Within the Covenant, there would be a significant birthing of 2 Lekgolos that would become to be known as the Colony. 3 years later, the International Society of Civil Engineers would finish constructing the Quito Space Tether, located in Quito. That was one of the many elevators that would be connected to stations in space. With every elevator being constructed, the men and women would be commended for their work with a monument and plaque. 5 years later, the UNSC Convention on Admiralty Law would begin with the provision for offences relating to conduct being carried out, or ones capable of being carried out, for purposes connected with piracy, and the first Orion project would begin this year as well, which was the UNSC's Navy's first effort in creating biochemical super soldiers. In 2317, one of the co-creators to the slip space drive being Thomas Fleming Shaw, who died at the age of 97, dying of natural causes. This would be followed by Wallace, the other creator to the drive, in the following year, dying at the age of 102, again of natural causes. In the next 2 years, in 2319, the Transport Dynamics AMG would design the first M12 Warthog prototype that would be nicknamed the Z12, and these vehicles would prove to be very successful due to the company marketing them to be the fastest and most efficient off-road vehicles at this time. In the following year, the Orion Project Phase 1 had been completed, and the records would be used to serve as a template for the catalyst in the next part of the phase, with Dr. Ritza Shepard leading the charge into these researches. Little did he know, though, that the Spartans who died defending Greece would re-emerge from the research he helped to create. In 2321, the AMG Transport Dynamics would begin working with the CMA, which would lead into establishing a deal with them to cover the costs of all of their land-based transportation enterprises. The Z12 would later be introduced as the M12 Warthog, with some modifications being added such as a swivel mount and armored body panels. In the next 4 years, the first phase of the Orion project would be put on hold for now, with the staff being involved being assigned to other locations. In 2329, the M12 Warthog would become the most common form of transport within the UNSC for its all-terrain capabilities. This is where the Warthog would get its initial name, as its manufactured name was to be the M12 FAV. The shyuum, known as Hodrumt, would be born in 2332, who would be later known as the Prophet of Mercy. However, humanity at this time would discover the Rosseliger blip that has history connecting all the way back to the time of the Halo array firing. Isobosis in 2349 would form the Mos Decius Union for over a dozen private fragmented mining groups for the Sol system. 13 years later, the first interstellar human starship would be launched in 2362 that would become the lead ship of the colony ships, which would spearhead the colonization of a new planet being named Reach. That begins the first wave of human expansion past the confines of their home system. The Committee of Minds for Security would hold a session to design models for the first case scenarios in the event of a hostile civilization being discovered or encountered. Near to the same time, the ship known as the CAA First Reverie would be built in the orbit of Mars, which would now be one of nearly 100 colony ships being built and added to the fleet from the lunar colony to further colonize new worlds, where the Domus Diaspora would be ignited. Unknown to humanity and the Covenant at this time, an event would soon break out in the following year that would threaten the existence of all sentient life in the galaxy with the return of the Flood. In the next decade, an unknown species would find Installation 05 in 2350 and begin to investigate it. However, after exploring the confines of the ring and embracing what it had to offer, they would find something that would embrace them on an intimate level, with the Flood breaking out of the containment systems that had been constructed to defend against such an intrusion. But some of the monitors, in their solitude at this time, had begun to fall into madness with the lack of a social partner to make sure the other remains balanced and focused. 2401 Penitent Tangent had allowed the species to land on the ring and to explore a little too much, and without warning them, the monitor had failed to stop the spread of the parasite. The Flood would continue to spread throughout the several complexes and would begin the cycle once more, with the species falling and becoming one with the Flood. The Monitor would then attempt to quell the infection process by deploying the Sentinels after the flood. However, what he did not know was in his neglect of the situation, a proto-gravemind had been festering within the inner workings of the installation deep below the surface. In 2364, the CAA Arbiter would claim to begin the colonization of Tribute in the Epsilon Eridani system, and the Earth government would recognize that the CAA Casbah had begun colonizing efforts within the system. The Assembly majority would make a suggestion in 2381 to the Committee of Minds for Security that the Assembly should relay their ideas to humanity indirectly. The colonization of the inner colonies in 2390 would be in a full swing motion, where there would be 210 human-occupied worlds that had been in many stages of terraforming, and the issues of overpopulation in this time would begin to calm down, allowing humanity to become stronger across the stars. 2 years later, the D-77TC Pelican would be put into service for the UNSC. The MA-5 series of assault rifle weaponry would be put into service with the UNSC 3 years later. In 2396, the Shyuum Ord Casto would be born, who would later become the Prophet of Truth, with his birth being on High Charity. In 2397, a planet that would be known as Actium would be colonized by the unified Earth government within the Erim system. In 2400, the EAP would begin a number of nationalization initiatives, including the construction of water purification facilities across Africa, which would eventually lead into Mount Kilimanjaro water plant being constructed, providing more work for the citizens of Earth. A year later, the space tether in Quito would be now in service and becomes officially named at this time. A monument would then be built into the memory and dedication of the two creators of the slip space drive. The Mark 9 Mantis would enter service of the UNSC within 2403. Aluvan would also become colonized by humanity in 2412, and the colonization of the outer colonies would begin. The M6 Magnum would enter service with the UNSC Armory 2 years later. 48452-556 EPN 644, a member of the Assembly, would suggest that each AIs should on occasional basis offer themselves to be dissected by humanity to limit suspicion about their activities in 2415. The M6S would also enter service with the UNSC at this time. In 2424, an ice quarry and magnetic mass driver would be shut down after the planet had begun to develop a climate of its own to support the rainfall on Saber, which was the third moon of Baiko, the human outer colony of Arcadia in the system of Procyon in 2429. 1 year later, back on Earth, in the African region, New Mombasa had taken over the entire island and the surrounding towns, which had been overrun by residents flooding the streets. The transition between Mombasa and New Mombasa was never officially made, but the residents who lived within the site of the space elevator would call it Old Mombasa. In the Hesetia system, on the gas planet known as Hesetia 5, would be under construction for a new colony for humanity, with it being founded as Meridian in the following year, and the M7S SMG would be added into the service of the UNSC. The colony in the next year would be settled by French colonists straight from Earth. Five years later, the MA-37 individual combat weapons system would be put into service for the UNSC in 2437. On Balaho, a more notable birth would occur, with the Ungoi Yap Yap being born in 2438. The human colony of Illyria begins to suffer a severe drought in 2453, which would last for the next 103 years, which would devastate the planet and kill half of the residents of the colony. A shyuum who would go on to become a politician would be born on High Charity within 2453. A year later, Robert Watts would be born on Mars at this time, who would go on to becoming the colonel of the insurrection faction that would become to be known as the United Rebel Front. A political party known as the Stewards would gain control of Meridian after a long campaign known as the Free Patriots Movement. A year after that, a new colony would be further established on Cassidy III. Within the Cassidy-Cybele system, however, it would be later abandoned by the authorities. Another year later, in 2459, Dr. Sandmore would receive his degree in nutrition and fitness from the New Cairo School of Advanced Medicine. In 2460, the sniper rifle known as the SRS-99 would enter service for the UNSC. Margaret Purangosky would be later born in 2461, where in her later life she would climb the ladder of Oni to become the commander-in-chief. This would be followed by the birth of Gerald Mulkey Ander, who would become a leader among the insurrection. In October of this year, Lord Mron would be born on High Charity, who would soon become the Prophet of Regret later down the line. Another advancement would also be made into this year, with the M8823 drop pod being developed and released to the UNSC, ready to be put into service. Throughout these advancements of the human race, the Covenant was soon to face a threat within their own order that would start between the Ungoi and the Kigya species, of which had decided to try and sterilize the Ungoi due to their reproductive capabilities, putting pressure on them as they were forced to share their habitats. In these moments of the Covenant's history, the Ungoi were seen to be nearly worthless in the Covenant forces, using them as cannon fodder, not even arming them on the battlefield. However, this was soon to change when the Ungoi would prove themselves to be a worthy foe. In 2462, the Ungoi Rebellion would break out on High Charity, with the larger forces gaining access to the Covenant's armory and slaughtering the Kigya, Sangheili warriors and the Lekgolos. In this fight, they would prove to be more than fierce than previously fought. The Ungoi were united and ruthless, destroying ships, vehicles, and killing much of the Covenant force. These conflicts would remain in the lower districts of High Charity, not even reaching the Prophets. However, they could see that this threat had the potential to be their end, so they had appointed a new Arbiter, Hekai Gabadi, to quell the rebellion, which proved to be very difficult due to their behavior on the battlefield and for their large numbers. However, the Arbiter would soon take a Covenant fleet to the Ungoi homeworld, where they would glass it, and the Prophets would broadcast this all over High Charity, forcing the Ungoi to helplessly watch as their home was to be destroyed. Traumatized from the events they had just bear witness to, they would eventually surrender. As word was sent to the Arbiter, he would cease the glassing, leaving the Ungoi homeworld mostly intact. This would mark the beginning of the 23rd Age of Doubt. However, when most would think to eradicate the Ungoi for their treachery, the Prophets saw that when they were properly motivated, the Ungoi could be competent fighters. They were vicious and tenacious creatures. If it had not been for the Arbiter and his quick thinking, the Covenant could have very well been dismantled by these Ungoi. Still a low tier of the Covenant, the Ungoi warriors would be classed as Sangheili-only units who would be given weapons and treated as soldiers rather than simple fodder. And soon, the high prophet of tolerance would promote better relations between all species of the Covenant. The Sangheili also showed a lot more respect for the smaller creatures in their ranks now. 4 years of healing the scars of battle, another notable Sangheili would be born on Sanghelios, being known as Telzataler. Harvest, also known as Epsilon Indi 4, would establish a human colony in the year of 2468. After the UNSC Skidbladnir had transported the colonists, it would remain in the system for surveillance of the colony so that they could keep a close eye on the colonists. In the following year, a new AI would be activated going by the name of Wellesley. Another year later, another notable name would be added to the Covenant's ranks, when Nizad Kavarosi would be born, who was a Sangheili. Another notable name would be born into humanity at this time, with that being known as Preston Cole, who would go on to work within the UNSC. The last record of this time would be the design choice and construction of a new Phoenix-class colony ship that would be known in the years to come as the Spirit of Fire. In 2471, Escharum, who was a brute, would be born, who would also go on to become one of the chieftains of the banished forces in the years to come. 2 years since the beginning of its construction, the Spirit of Fire would be born in 2473, and Coleman had accepted the position of Captain of the Spirit of Fire. Another year into the future, we come into one of the more notable names of human history, with his name being known as Avery Johnson. And a family of the name Hannibal would settle on 30 acres in the Pori region, which would soon lay down the foundations to become the city of Pilvros. Bassus would soon be born on Tish, who was too a brute, who would go on to become a chieftain within the banished forces later in his history. However, humanity would soon be met by another conflict among themselves, with civilian uprisings breaking out in the outer colonies against the unified Earth government in 2475. Another year later, the brute known as Macubus would be born on Doisak in 2477. A Sangheili would be born who would be named Let Voler, who would become a mercenary under the command of the Covenant and later the Banished. A year later, another brute would be born on Doisak, being known as Lidus, and a future Arbiter would be born on Malarok, known as Riper Morimi, and James Cutter would be born on the same year on the planet of Reach. Hobarotome would also be born on Sanghelios in 2479, and Chaleb's defense solutions would be further established on Meridian that was situated in the outer colonies. At this time, the Flood had crippled the Sentinels with their newfound intelligence of the newly formed Gravemind form, which had instructed its brethren to capture Penitent Tangent so that they may be able to bring the construct to their side with the Logic Plague, leaving the core systems of the Sentinels to repel the parasite unsupervised in his absence. In 2480, the Shyuum known as Dehaz Bahazvod would be born, who would later become the Prophet of Truth's assassin. A year after that, the Sangheili Pargavor would be born on Malarok, which was a Covenant colony world, and another advancement would be made with the M41 SPNKR entering the service of the UNSC. 3 years later, more civilian uprisings would continue to break out among the outer colonies. AMG would now begin to design and manufacture light armor designed vehicles. In 2484, the position of captain for the Spirit of Fire would be transferred from Coleman to Rekov, and Fel Vadim would also be born on Sanghelios, and in the following year, Michael Stanforth would be born on Earth. Vorona Manticree would be born in 2487 and Selir Yon would be born as well. Rataz Vadum would also be born on this year as well. The Secession Union and People's Occupation Organization would demand for independence from Earth for a dozen different worlds. With the tension rising on the outer colonies, it would soon reach the boiling point, with violence breaking out in the colonies. Preston Cole in 2488 would enlist within the UNSC Navy. Zaitan Ja Watinri would also be born in this year. The Sangheili, known as Inslan, would also be born in 2489. Joel Dama would also be born, and Danforth Whitcomb would be born on Earth. Later in the year, Preston Cole would formulate new ways of calculating slip-space coordinates, attracting the attention of his superiors, which would then give him more opportunities to climb the ladder. Another Sangheili would be born in the following year that was called Jagaradomni, and Terence Hood would also be born on Earth later in the year. The yearly reports would show that human space had claimed more than 800 worlds in their expansion across the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy. The outer expansion would continue from here on out, and the inner colonies would become political and economical strongholds, even though that they would still heavily rely on the outer colonies for raw materials. At this time, Reach would become the UNSC Navy's primary ship and training academy for special forces. In January of 2491, 484-52556 EPN 644, who was a member of the Assembly, would submit to humanity to be dissected with the intention of sparking an interest in the dormant project of Orion, in which he would be successful, as at the end of January, the Orion project would be reinstated to produce super soldiers, where Gladys Wilson would volunteer for the project while being trained on Reach for special forces. In April, humanity would discover the planet-sized forerunner megastructure known as Onyx, and they would investigate, which in the next month the investigators would file a report to recommend the planet for colonization. In July, the brute known as Tartarus would be born, and at the end of the year, the M99 Station would be put into service with the UNSC. The Assembly would also scratch Onyx off of its list for colonization due to the large presence of alien technology on the planet. The Spirit of Fire would soon get a new captain, with Captain Donald becoming the captain of the Spirit of Fire. At the end of the year, Ned Rich would be born as well. In February 2492, a report would be filed on the geological studies being carried out on Onyx. Catherine Halsey would then be born in the following month, and Franklin Mendez would be born in March. In June, Preston Cole would be on watch at the Third Shadow Perimeter. On the 7th of June, however, Preston would testify to the Board of Inquiry at the Lunar OCS Academy, with the number of incidents with the impregnation of Inna Volkov, the daughter of Admiral Konrad Volkov. The charges would be dropped against him, however, and the investigation would clear him of any wrongdoing. The testimony of Cole would then be sealed by an order known as UNSC-JAG ORD 8-PD-3861 in the middle of June. Preston and Inna would then be married on the 17th of August, and the certificate of their union would be officially recorded on the 21st of August. And Inna would eventually give birth to Ivan Troy Cole in the early hours of the morning at the 12th of December. Preston would accept the child, even though he knew it was not his. 4 days later, the birth certificate would be registered. Orna Falsami would also be born on December the 22nd. Near the end of the year, a very large rebellion would break out on the colony world of Far Isle, with the UNSC struggling to contain it. Bandersnatch would then be declared, and nuclear weapons would be used against the rebellion in an attempt to quell them. During this time, however, the Covenant had made their first contact on the Brute home world, and they would see that the Brutes had fought against each other, effectively sending them back to the pre-industrial age, which was instrumental in their forced union with the Covenant, who had the upper hand against them, marking this species to be the final cog of the Covenant, with the Covenant forces becoming an ultimate force of domination. The Sangheili known as Okro-Vagadun would also be born, and the Brute known as Avitus would be born a month later in 2493. At some point in this year, a significant uprising would occur within the population centers on Talitsa, and the UNSC Valiant would be commissioned and released from the Mars shipyards, being the first of a new design, with that being known as the Valiant-class Super Heavy Cruisers. The next year, in January, the UNSC Callisto would perform a routine checkup and inspection of a colonial ship. The inspection goes completely wrong, however, with deaths occurring on the colonist side. The insurgents had taken the ship and were now in control of Callisto, issuing no heads up or warnings to the unsuspecting colonists. Once the UNSC got the word of the Callisto going rogue and attacking colony ships, they would send 3 destroyer-class ships after the insurgents, which would be residing in the 26th Draconius system, and the conflict would be the beginning of the Insurrection Civil War. A month later, the Sangheili known as Rajuka Kasin would be born. In June, the rebels under the leadership of Colonel Robert Watts, who used to be a Marine in the UNSC, would begin a series of attacks in the Eridanus system, in which in December the government would also call for aid to deal with the rebels. In 2495, Colonel Robert Watts would lead the Insurrection Union into claiming Eridanus II at the beginning of the year. In the following month, Jacob Keyes would be born on Earth. In some part of this period, the UNSC would take control of the station UNSC Hopeful, and they would add fusion reactors along with a translite engine to the station, turning it into the largest known mobile battlefield hospital in human history. The VK-78 Commando would be introduced into the colonial military service, replacing the HMG-38 heavy machine guns, and another insurrection organization by the name of the Sundered Legion would start fueling the conflicts through Meridian. After these conflicts, the siege of Aphia would begin. That would be between the forces of the UNSC and the Sundered Legion that would last for the next 2 years. At the beginning of 2496, all Diligence-class light destroyers would be fitted with 2 powerful outrigger Mach systems. During the siege of Aphia, Orion operatives would attack the rebels, cutting them down quickly in a silent operation. This would result in 1 casualty for the operatives, but many losses for the rebels. Operation Charomagnon would also begin later on in this year, where the Eridanus insurrection would be defeated by the UNSC, with the only cost being the 4 destroyed destroyer ships. In this operation, the Orion operatives would be sent in, and with their combined efforts, they would set the insurrection back, with them remaining active in the system, with their command escaping through the asteroid belt. After the operation had concluded, the Orion operatives would uncover a list of undercover secessionist Union operatives all working within the CMA. During the operation, the SP-42 Cobra had entered service within the UNSC. In 2497, the CMA's involvement with the insurrection force within Eridanus would be made public, and their power would soon shift toward the UNSC's control. Later on in this year, the UH-144 Falcon helicopter would enter service within the UNSC. The UNSC would also reintroduce the Valiant-class ships to be used in counter-operations against insurgency. 2 years from the 26th century in 2498, the colony of Arcadia would open the Deep Space Research Array that was designed to research and study extremely high gravity events that include black holes and other areas of space that ships cannot enter without causing a significant threat to the safety of the crew. Later in the year, Decimus would be born. The AC-220 Vulture gunship would enter service within the UNSC this year. Cesar Rafumi would be born in 2499 and Theodrus would also be born with Gekla. During this year, the position of captain on the Spirit of Fire would change again, switching from Captain Donald to Captain Johnson. The Janet-class ship would also enter service, being manufactured by Halifax Space Works, and also being manufactured by Aerofabric SA. The Huygens-class surveying ship would enter service around this time too. The Hillborough-class destroyer ship would also enter service, being manufactured by Ceres Industrial Metals. In the 26th century, 2500, Inna Volkov would be unhappy with her marriage and would file for divorce, and Preston would attempt to talk her out of it, but to no avail. Andrew Del Rio would also be born in this year on Earth. Deculion would also be born on Diasac along with Carlos Wambia. The UNSC at this time would also begin Operation Kaleidoscope, which would consist of classified surgical strikes against some very prominent insurgent leaders. In the following year, John Forge would be born on Earth. The UNSC at this time had begun an engagement with the insurrectionists in the Theta Ursae Majoris system. The UNSC Gorgon and the Insurrection Bellicos would continue to fight into a stalemate. In September, Preston had become a captain and would tell his brother via a letter to tell Ina and his kids that he loves them before returning to duty. An additional 2 months later, Chris Preston would be born. Later in the year, the Brute Ballas would be born. The following year, Preston would write to his brother telling him of Lyrene Castilla, telling him of how great she is within plasma physics. He would suggest that Michael and Molly Cole visit the outer colonies. The following day, the leader of the Secessionist Union in Harvest, Gerald Mulkey Ander, would be assassinated by Avery Johnson. Captained by Preston Cole, the UNSC Gorgon would engage the insurrectionist forces, but would be damaged in the skirmish at Cape Hela, resulting in the deaths of 32 crew members. The damage would be so extensive that the ship would need to be examined for repairs at the nearest space dock, where it would remain for a month. Preston at this time would tell his brother in a letter about the battle. He would also tell him about his plans with Lyrene, who he would soon marry in December of this year. In 2503, Admiral Harold Stanford would send a transmission to Captain Preston Cole, telling him the unfortunate news that his wife was in fact an insurrectionist leader and that he has only 3 hours to bring her in, when he would find that she had already fled the scene. Preston would write to his brother Michael of what had just been revealed to him and that his wife was the captain of the Bellicos. Both Jake Courage and Ellen Anders would be born later in this year. The following year, a battle for control would break out in the Theta Ursae Majoris system between the insurrectionists and the UNSC. The UNSC Secrets Act of 2504 would be passed this year, which meant the protection of classified information. The next year, the brute known as Heckabee would be born. Captain Johnson's time on the Spirit of Fire would also come to an end in the same year, and a building would be built on top of a forerunner ruin under the name of the Hannibal family. In 2506, Gage Yevgeny would be born on the planet of Harvest. Sandra Tilson would also be born, followed by Zeritus being born on Diasac. The next phase of the Orion project would soon finish and be put on hold with the deactivation of the project. In 2507, Cadmon Lasky would be born on the colony of Mars. Hugo Barton would also be born at this time. Halsey, in the meantime, would climb her way through the scientific ranks, and the UNSC would approve of her grant proposal for artificial intelligence control of n-dimensional matrices. It is through these endeavors that Halsey would become interested in joining with the UNSC to end the insurrection. Rogan would become the new captain for the Spirit of Fire, and the construction of the Pillar of Autumn would soon begin. James Gregory Cutter would also be assigned to the UNSC Brilliant Shores. In 2508, April Orinsky would be born on the planet of Harvest. In another pocket of space, the Assembly would hold a session where they would begin discussing the Orion project, talking about what went wrong with it, and how to make adjustments to improve on what came before, noting that the project was to be a necessary step in order to get to their primary goal. Franklin Mendez would leave for Reach at this time, after he had enlisted within the UNSC, who would eventually train the subjects in the Spartan 2 and 3 projects. Catherine Halsey at this time would begin working for the Office of Naval Intelligence. The M850 Grizzly battle tank would also be added to the arsenal of the UNSC in 2509. In this year, the separate rebel cells would combine together under the leadership of Robert Watts, who would then rename the faction as the United Rebel Front. In the year of 2510, Atriox, Thomas Lasky, Edward Buck, Michael Sullivan, Kelly 087, Karis R. Penault, Castor, and the Spartan 2 subjects would all be born this year. Halsey would travel and arrive on Reach at this time. The Pillar of Autumn this year would also be launched, soaring away from Mars following its construction. The AI known as Dumb AI Deja would also be activated this year. The Mark III exoskeletons would be made as well, however it would soon fail with their projects moving towards the Monolithia project instead. In 2511, George 052, John 117, Linda 058, Frederick 104, Seren Osman, Douglas 042, Petra Genexic, Jerome 092, Caleb 095, Samuel 095, Alice 130, Naomi 010, Kurt 051, and Randall 037 had all been born this year. Halsey at this time would be going over the fundamentals in the Spartan 2 program, where she would soon learn of a terrorist threat within the Freedom and Liberation Party. Later in the year, she would continue to work on the future armor that would become the Mjolnir-powered assault armor. The terrorist threat Halsey had identified would detonate the nuclear bomb, killing 2 million people and injuring a further 8.3 million people in Mamor at the Haven Archaeology. After hearing of the tragic events, Halsey would continue her work, going through the breakdowns of neural cloning that would soon become flash cloning, which would be instrumental in the kidnapping of the children in the next phase of the Orion project, allowing the subjects to be replaced. However, the cloning would be only successful for a limited time before they would begin to deteriorate. At this moment, however, a report would soon come back from Onyx, informing the recipients of the Forerunner artifacts being discovered in Zone 67 that it was under excavation at this time. The brute known as Hyperius would be born in 2512, who would go on to become the Spartan killer later in his life. By the 19th of December of this year, the Superintendent AI would be created. Admiral Stanforth would also be appointed as the head of Section 3 of ONI, and the M392 marksman rifle would be put into service as well within the UNSC. In 2513, the leadership of Robert Watts would continue to pay off with the rebel United Front retaking Iridius II. A few months later, however, the UNSC would begin Operation Trebuchet, where they would successfully attack and push the rebellion out, with many of them making it out of the battle in their evacuation of the location. Halsey at this time would decide on naming the Spartan 2 project as the Orion Project Generation 2. Ram Chalva would also be born later on in this year. In the following year, Lieutenant James Gregory Cutter would be relocated to the UNSC Final Summit, and Franklin Mendez would be transferred to Naval Special Weapons. The brute Tulverius and Veronica Dare would also be born in 2515. Halsey in this year would become the scientific advisor for ONI, and Ethan Graves would also be born. And in 2516, Jane Shibara would also be born. 2517 would be the year for the next part of the Spartan project, with it beginning with Dr. Halsey initiating the screening process for the candidates. Vice Admiral Stanforth would provide her with transport to begin her search for the necessary subjects. Jacob Keyes would accompany her as well. This would be where the pair and the rest of the teams would find the subjects, or candidates as they would call them. However, she would not be taking adults into consideration, as the previous phases had, and instead, this one was to be different, with selecting children to be a part of the experiments. As their bodies were still developing, it could be possible they may survive the project and go further beyond it, so that they could become the soldiers that humanity would need for what was to come. The children would soon be taken against their will and are all rounded up. The saddest part of this operation was that Naomi was on her way home for her birthday, getting off the bus from music practice. She would be snatched to be rounded up with the others. Her parents would soon sound the alarm, and the police would search for her with pelicans. However, they would not have far to search when a girl that looked identical to her would be found at the bus stop, which was one of the Flash clones. It's truly disturbing and very sad that with such technology and scientific discovery, a group of children could be kidnapped and replaced with Flash clones that would slowly deteriorate over time, simulating a natural progression for their scheduled death to limit suspicion and consequence for their actions, or more likely, her actions. However, if this operation was not to occur, perhaps the Covenant would have been successful in their attempts to wipe humanity from the face of the galaxy or the universe as a whole. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, then please hit the like button, comment your thoughts below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Sign up to join the British Alliance today by subscribing to the channel and ring in the notification bell to receive all notifications so that you are always notified to see the new videos pop up, and I will see all of you among the cosmos, and be sure to have a good one.